it got so crazy that the representatives from Granger and from,
Insane.
Center and from Clay Township went down to Indy. They were state reps,
Nuts.
and they got the state to change the state law for annexations for only St. Joe County.
Nuts.
For only St. Joe County. They passed one law for only it was only counties of this type of population. That was us.
It was literally an amendment was added that made the bill applicable to counties in Indiana, only counties in Indiana with a population between 200 and 300,000, and St. Joe County was the only county. You heard that there. In South Bend Mayor Joe Kernan's battle in the early 90s to annex parts of St. Joe County into the city, the state legislature passed a law to basically make it impossible for South Bend to expand. More of that later, but first, welcome to Round the Bend Now and Then, a podcast that shines a light on the South Bend and Mishawaka areas past and present. Through interviews with local business owners, leaders, and community members, our listeners and I learn together about all of the great people and great things going on in our community, as we also learn about South Bend and Mishawaka's history and how intertwined our past is with our present. Think way back to the pandemic era. I saw an article published on West SB's website titled, "More People: How South Bend Lost 50,000 People in 50 Years. Obviously, that piqued my interest. Within the first paragraph of the article, I was hooked. It read, "Take a drive or walk through many South Bend neighborhoods, especially of the grand late 19th century mansions or the tightly packed, narrow 1910s and 1920s houses built close to a long abandoned streetcar line. And an immediate fact will occur to you: South Bend used to be the home of many more people." Obviously, being born in 1978, I've always heard about the heyday of our city and how bustling it used to be with all of the shopping downtown and all of the industries, including Bendix, Studebaker, Oliver, Singer, and so forth. By the time I was a kid in the 80s, all I saw was the remnants of those industries. Huge, hulking, nasty, rusted out looking factories that looked like they could honestly withstand an atom bomb. To most people who live here, it's a given that our city used to have a lot more people. And I bet if you asked most people in our city their opinions of why we lost so many people, they'd say it was because of December 20th, 1963. The day Studebaker closed their automotive plant in South Bend. I myself probably would say the same thing, because I knew our city's population started to shrink right around the same time Studebaker closed. I knew at that time, in the early 1960s, our city had over 130,000 people. And most of my lifetime, it's teetered around that 100,000 people mark. Definitely quite a decline. The rest of the article was so intriguing, providing details about our city and the real-life implications on neighborhoods when we lose population. Plus, I love learning about how our neighborhoods have evolved and changed over the years. Also, there were some cool old pictures on there, so this article was really scratching my itch. Then, at the end of the article, it absolutely had me sold. It said it was going to push back on the assumption that our city lost all of these people simply because Studebaker closed. It said that only provided a glimpse of the story. And as it turns out, this article was only an introduction to a series of 7 articles that were to be released every 2 weeks that, quote, "will explore the process of how South Bend, which had grown for nearly its entire 120-year existence up until 1960, began a half-century of decline. Each article will attempt to explore a part of this larger story and, with luck, provide information on how to move forward. By telling this story, I intend to properly put into context how we think about South Bend's past. Many of the common assumptions about what happened in South Bend in the second half of the 20th century ring true. Studebaker and other manufacturers floundered and fled the city, leading to a drastic decline. This isn't false, but it only tells a glimpse of the story by missing a lot of factors in the process. I could not wait to read the More People articles, and every 2 weeks a new article telling our city's story was released, and I'm telling you, I have yet to read or see anything like it that paints such a clear picture of our city and St. Joe County in a manner that is understandable and cuts through so many misconceptions. The author provided so many examples that helps the reader understand the population shifts in our area. But by learning about these population shifts, we are also learning about the history of our area and how it was shaped over the decades. In this episode, I meet with the author of the articles, Joe Molnar. Joe is a lifelong South Bend resident. His family goes back 4 generations in our city. He's a married father of 2 young children. He works in development with the city, so he is very in tune to the ins and outs of South Bend. You'll hear us discuss a little background behind why he wrote the More People series and how it kind of organically took off. Then I ask him some questions based off of the articles. But please know, folks, this is only one little podcast episode. I highly encourage my listeners to first read the More People series on West SB and then listen to the corresponding podcast episodes, also titled More People, that are aligned to each article. You can find both the articles and the podcast links on westsb.com, or I also have the link in the show notes. The More People podcast is also on all of the popular podcast platforms. Again, I highly encourage you to dive in and read the articles and listen to the podcasts. Before we dive into the content of Joe's More People series, we get into how the idea started and then evolved. I've never read anything like that about our city. I've never seen anything that comprehensive that really just pulls in everything.
Yeah, it was a work of love, and it was a lot of work. But mostly because no one had done it.
No.
And I was, I would play around with the data, and I would, I'm nerdy, so I would just, it was COVID, so I didn't have much to do. But it actually all started because Jacob Titus was doing a day in the life of South Bend kind of podcast. I forget what he called it. And it was every day he would read like a short South Bend Tribune article.
Yes.
And he did it for a couple months during COVID just because he was bored. And I reached out to him like, have you ever seen how they covered the census results back in the 60s? Like when all these bad numbers were coming out, what was the response? He's like, I haven't found anything, but he generously gave me his newspapers.com, log. And he said, go crazy. And I thought it'd be like one little, like I'd write one little article about, like, oh, like this is how they covered it.
Yeah.
But when I dug into it, I'm like, they didn't even cover it that much.
Wow.
It was, and that intrigued me. I'm like, what was going on that they weren't like, there would be an article or two, but it wasn't that crazy. So that's how it started, that it became this. And then I wrote like the first article, what's now Article 1. And Jake's like, you have to like make this a full series. And do it right. I'm like, okay.
So the first article was you didn't plan on writing additional ones.
I knew by the time it published I would.
Okay.
But when I wrote it,
I see.
80% through, I sent him my rough draft, and he's like, you clearly have a lot more you want to say.
Yes.
You need to flesh this out. Like, take all the time you're like, I'll give you West SB for a few months, to publish. Go crazy. And it's something I'm proud of. That
you should be.
And it's there forever, hopefully. So,
and when it was coming out, I think didn't you release them like a week apart?
Yeah, I think it was every other week we'd release. So we'd release an article, and then we would do a podcast about it the next week, and then so every 2 weeks I was pumping these out for like 4 months, and it was probably the most like writery author thing I've ever done. And it got national press. Strong Towns, which is a national, they did a whole write-up on it.
That's awesome.
Published, and then a couple of big urbanist people. Yeah, and I think it got like 40,000 views or 30,000 views, something like that.
Really?
All of them combined.
Correct.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
So for something like just so specific about South Bend, it clearly tapped into something I think people were interested in.
Truly did. I was waiting. I mean, for like it was during COVID too. Like I said, I was waiting. I'd read one and I thought, I can't wait for the next.
There's nothing else to do, right? Like,
even if it wasn't during COVID,
yeah.
I would be all up on it. Next, I asked him how we got into the census And that led us back to the discussion on how his More People series was organically created. How did you get into all the census and all of that type of stuff?
Yeah, I don't even know how. I've always been a history nerd.
Okay.
I mean, that was my major, so I dual majored in college with political science and American history. So always, had a background in that. And then it was right around 2018, 2019, I just started, curiously getting into it, especially the Mayor Pete thing was at its full arc. And then he ran for president. And so, I think it was actually him running for president that pushed it, because I would see stuff online, both for and against Pete, that was just so stupid and so wrong. Like, that wasn't grounded in any actual facts. So, not that, Pete didn't have issues.
Correct.
But the narrative that was forming about South Bend, I just hated. And I thought it was very East Coast, West Coast looking at South Bend through whatever problems they had. They're like, oh, well, we have this gentrification problem in, Boston.
Yeah.
So it must be happening here.
Right.
And it's like, well, we are not you.
Correct.
And we do not have your problems. And you don't have our problems. So, all that stuff just started getting me into it.
Yeah.
And then the pandemic hit and I was bored. And I started, working with Jacob Titus about it, and we started sending stuff back and forth. I'm like, oh, I found this stat. Oh, I found this. What do you think? And, it just kind of snowballed into this big series.
Isn't the way that stuff always happens? Where it's like
always,
you just
you
snowball.
can never plan it.
No.
No, we can never plan that 5 year. Like, you could never say, okay, Jake, you and I are going to sit down and write this $40,000 or 40,000, word series and do a big podcast, 9 episodes or whatever. Like, we would never plan that, but it just kind of organically grew.
When you read the articles, you'll find that what Joe writes about is not just numbers and data, it's our local history. And he articulates that local history in a manner that tells a story. And we talk about that next. Because it's not just census and numbers, man, it's our history.
Yeah, I tried to tell a story.
Yes.
I mean, I will never say I'm a great author or witty author, but I tried to tell it in a way that was engaging.
Yes.
And not just literally here's a bunch of spreadsheets.
Yes.
You figure it out. But I tried to say, what do these numbers mean? Because that's what the census is to me so important. And when you talk about demographics, it's so important because it's people.
Yes.
You can get caught up in the numbers and the stats of it, but every single number is a person and who has a whole family story, who has a whole life, once in Jesus. And so when you see years and years of a city shrinking, that means something that should be told. That's a story that should be thought about, and not just. And I think a lot of people, especially around here, like I grew up in the 90s, it was kind of just assumed, like, yeah, well, South Bend, we were important and now we're not important. And like the consequences of that is we're smaller, than we used to be. And it was almost like a given. But I'm like, if you went and talked to someone from 1960 and told them, hey, the next 5 decades, this is what's going to happen.
They would say you're crazy.
They'd be like, you're an idiot. We've been growing for 120 years.
Yes.
Like, maybe Studebaker's struggling, but we'll be fine. Like there was no precedence for what was about to happen to the Rust Belt. Anywhere in like human history, anywhere in American history, what happened to this region was unprecedented.
What happened in this region was unprecedented. Next, we get into the meat of the More People series, and I ask him about the first article, No Neighborhood in South Bend Avoided Decline. And as you'll hear, one of the 3 reasons for the decline that he writes about, it isn't Studebaker, it isn't abandoned houses. Next, Joe explains how even the most thriving of neighborhoods, even across the country, still experience population loss. The first article, No Neighborhood in South Bend Avoided Decline, I mean, you laid out 3 basic reasons for the population decline that we faced. And you did a great job, again, of pointing out the misconceptions. I guarantee if I went on the streets with a microphone and you asked 10 people, you asked 100 people, why do you think we have lost population over the years? I bet 90% would say something about Studebaker or industry. But that's not the case. When I first read it, there's something as simple as shrinking household size.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
It's it's the most simple concept
Basic and
that
simple.
no one ever thinks of when they
No.
see population data. So essentially what household size is, it's just how many people live in a housing unit.
Mhm.
So typically in South Bend, it's a house, but also as an apartment, any
Mhm.
housing unit. And I always use the example of my house
Yeah.
is when my house was built, the family ended up having 5 people at their biggest. They
Yeah.
had 3 kids and, 2 parents. And they lived there for 20 years, and
Uh-huh.
then the kids moved away, but the
Mhm.
parents didn't move away.
Mhm.
So you had organic, natural population decline, especially if you look at if a neighborhood is all built up over 10 or 15 years, so all the houses are kind of on the same life path.
Yeah.
All those kids leaving is going to happen at the same time.
Mhm.
So you're going to see drops in a neighborhood's
Cyclical.
population right away. And yeah, some houses people sell them after 5 years, but the whole neighborhood now, once you get like 100 years down the line, like, a lot of our neighborhoods,
Mhm.
it's all mixed together because
Yeah.
the houses have all, been sold at different times, I think. But that
Right.
first generation, you see that decline. But then also now I live in the house
Mhm.
and I only have 2 kids with my wife.
That's
So right
naturally
there, my
1/3
own
less.
house has suffered a 20%
Uh-huh.
population decline.
Mhm.
And that's happened everywhere in the city.
Right.
Like,
right.
It's happened. This is not a South Bend problem.
Of course.
Or even a problem, but this is just something that happens.
Fact.
Yeah, it's a fact of life that we have
Yeah.
smaller families than we used to have.
Yeah.
Everywhere, right? I'm sure anyone listening, their parents' generation's probably bigger than theirs, and their
Right.
grandparents' generation is certainly bigger than theirs when
Right.
it comes to aunts, uncles, grandparents,
Yep.
siblings.
Yep.
And so when you look at that as a city, if you do not build enough new housing
Mhm.
to make up for that, you're gonna if your housing stock is flat,
Yeah.
and not shrinking,
Yep.
not growing, you're gonna lose population.
Naturally.
Naturally, it just happens.
Mhm.
That's just a matter of fact since this country's been founded.
Yep, yep. And you mentioned the Sunnymead cycles, and I grew up in Sunnymead, and I've seen it firsthand. When I was a kid, it was my parents are baby boomers age,
Yeah.
right? So when I was a kid, they were younger, and
Mhm.
they had. I mean, they were having kids, and there were us kids all over the neighborhood.
Yeah.
I mean, like in packs of 5,
Yeah.
6,
Yeah.
10. But then as I got older, and then I moved back to Sunnymead, a lot of my friends' parents are now retired,
Yeah.
and they're still
They're
living
still
here.
living there. They're still in
And that household is that much smaller.
Yeah, and there's not a problem with
Oh,
that.
no.
It's just on paper then if you see a
Yes.
population decline,
Yep.
it doesn't necessarily mean the neighborhood's declining.
Nope.
It doesn't necessarily mean that the property values
Nope.
or that the people's lives are declining, but it is a shift in, what it looks
Exactly.
like. I live in Sunnymead too now, and
Yep.
I think it's me and my wife are the only ones with kids
See?
on the block.
And that street 30 years ago was nothing but kids all day. every
Sunnymead
day.
used to have a household population of basically 4 a house.
Okay.
Now it's down to 2.2.
See, look at that. It's almost cut in half.
Yeah. And that just
Wow.
so you walk down the street, and there's no vacant lots,
None.
there's no vacant houses, all the lights are on at night,
Yep.
these houses are lived in, but it's a neighborhood that's suffered population growth. Now, what does that mean for your city though?
What does this mean for our city, though? Next, Joe shares exactly what can happen when we have the same geographical footprint but less kids. It's something that I have experienced firsthand, the closing of a school.
So because we built a school system to support a Sunnymead type, all across the city, right? This, where every family has 2 to 5 kids, basically.
Mhm.
And now we're in a situation where you have the same geographic footprint, but a lot less kids, way less kids.
Yeah.
So what does that do for your school system? Because the brick and mortar's there, right? We built all these schools for this population that now is just never going to come back.
Yeah.
And that's something, obviously anyone
this
following
day.
the news
To
this
this
last
day.
week. So there are big consequences if you don't keep building new housing.
Yeah.
People always say, why do we have to grow? Why is, population growth so important? And it's not that it's important in and of itself,
Right.
but the consequences of decline are so negative that you
Yes.
have to be prepared for those.
Yes. We're going through it now. I've been the principal of a school that closed. I had to lead a school community through that. And I can tell you, there is not one thing that is good about it. Nothing. I will reserve my opinions on the other reasons why urban public schools are losing students, but we'll save that for another day. Next, we continue discussing the first article, No Neighborhood in South Bend Avoided Decline, and we talk about a basic recipe for a neighborhood's collapse, smaller family size, and loss of houses. When we think of population decline, I think most people think about what you had noted as free fall neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I just want to read a quick quote from here, and it kind of sums it up. Neighborhoods such as these are like the candle being burned from two ends. Declining numbers of households, and the households that remain are smaller. And it's just a recipe for neighborhood collapse. You had specifically mentioned, just as an example, the neighborhood by the city cemetery as a free-falling neighborhood. So talk to me a little bit about that.
I mean, it really is candle burning.
Literally.
So you have the same thing that's happening in, what I will say a stable neighborhood, like River Park, where you're going to have less kids naturally because you're not building, all the houses are built. There's no more land for new houses, but you have less kids each year. Right. So you're having that dynamic. And you're having less adults too, because there's a lot of single households too. So you're having less, income earners too sometimes. So you're having that, but then you're adding in a lot of the issues that the west side and the southeast side have experienced, where you've had, large scale vacancy, large scale demolition of houses. And so you're up to a neighborhood where there used to be, 10 houses on this block. Now there's 4 houses on the block, and each house has less people in it. You are having this where, you're having neighborhoods that have lost 60, 70% of their population. And that's when you really get into the societal issues of the city still has to pave that street.
You're darn right.
If there's 4 houses on it, if there's 2 houses on
20,
it,
they have to.
They have to pay that. They have to do, yard waste pickup. They have to do trash pickup. The car, they have to provide police and fire protection for that same geographic area. But you have way less taxpayers paying on it. You have way less kids going to schools from those neighborhoods. You've built a whole neighborhood that now has a third of the population. Nearby businesses that were around because they had this large population now can't survive because a small local corner store, if 2/3 of the customers leave, it's going to close.
Gone.
So what are that the free fall neighborhood is exactly what the worst case scenario. And that's usually what people understand when you talk about population decline. But what I was trying in that first article to say is that the reason South Bend's numbers is so bad is it's not just a west side problem.
Exactly.
It's not just a southeast problem. It's a whole city problem.
Yes.
And we just did not grow enough to make up for the decline, both on the west and southeast sides, but then the stable neighborhoods as
well. So many ill effects of a free fall neighborhood, man. Next, we talk about how it was suburbanization and not Studebaker. And that goes into your second article where you mentioned suburbanization. It wasn't suburbanization, not Studebaker. And then one of the later articles, you really focused on the annexation. But when you mentioned in the suburbanization, not Studebaker, that there's a few stages in our city, and the stage you had noted from 1940 to 60, our population increased even.
Yes.
And even though our population was growing, but families were still moving from the inner city neighborhoods, it's just that the city of South Bend was capturing all of these folks moving out to the suburbs. And when we think suburbs, we might think Granger, but at this time,
it was
Edison Park, Eastgate, McKinley Terrace, Miami Hills, Keller Park, all of these, which were already in the city.
Yeah. I mean, for the entire history of the city, people wanted to be in the city. Leading up to about 1950, 1960, when the shift of mindset happened after World War II, is being in the city meant you got water and sewer. It meant you got a paved road. It meant you got police and fire protection as opposed to volunteer forces. All these benefited things. So how is a city supposed to grow?
Yeah.
It's supposed to grow outwards and up, right? So if it grows out, as a city's population, as a region's population grows, you're supposed to annex more territory on that because everyone's in this together, right? And what we started seeing happening in the 50s and 60s is neighborhoods, and areas started fighting back.
Yeah.
And they said, we don't want to be annexed. It would be farmland that a developer would come in, build a new subdivision, but they would not annex into the city. And for a variety of reasons, mostly for tax reasons, but then also some school reasons. A lot of reasons were built into that. Some racial,
of course, red line and all that stuff.
So they tried to, get out of South Bend. And what that led to was eventually is the region kept growing.
Mhm.
I always, one of the stats that I remember Jacob Titus didn't believe
Right.
was that St. Joe County has more people today than it's ever had in its history. We have 40,000 more people in this county than we did at Studebaker's Height. But anyone living in St. Joe County understands it's all one economy.
You're darn right.
Right? We're all one, regional,
Mhm.
apparatus. So if Studebaker's closing was so negative, and I'm not saying it was good by any means.
No,
but if Bendix's decline, if Studebaker Oliver's decline, if it was so bad, yes, relative to the nation, our county has grown poorly.
Yeah.
But it has still grown.
Mhm.
Again, there are more people here today than there were at Studebaker's Height. It's just they've chosen to live outside of the city
Right.
limits. So when you have this situation where more and more people don't want to live and they actively fight to stay out, it leads to negative consequences, right? And that's why suburbanization, not Studebaker, because I always say this region could have, South Bend could have survived Studebaker.
Yeah.
It could have survived all these things. If you imagine a different world where instead of the county and basically the city of South Bend splintering into Granger and Mishawaka and all these other, in the unincorporated Clay Township and all these other splinter groups, if it had just been one region and had one focus, you wouldn't have seen this type of, decay that happened in parts of South Bend.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear Joe write and talk about how Fort Wayne, Indiana was able to thrive and grow while we've done the opposite.
Yeah, Fort Wayne, I always say, is the best example.
Yes.
Because it looked very much like South Bend in 1960. They had a slightly larger population, but for a lot of reasons, both political will and also the way that they just can't do well in septic like we could up here.
Yeah, you noted that in the articles too. Our soil here was perfect.
Yeah, it was, and now we're leading into, consequences of that. But at the time, they're like, oh, this is amazing. Well, in septic, we don't need the city anymore. Fort Wayne just annexed everything.
Yeah. Yep.
There is no Granger in Fort Wayne.
No.
There is no, they don't even have a Mishawaka. They have a New Haven, which is a small town. It's very, very small. They have no other entity besides them. So they can have regional planning. They can have all the revenue from one region actually going to the central, city that can distribute it, right? We don't have that here. We have this splintered, balkanized region, and Fort Wayne has thrived. It's still growing quickly. It's twice the size of us. It has less crime levels. Its schools, while having issues just like ours, don't have the same. They're not closing schools like we are. So it's all these positive, down the line consequences could have happened if South Bend could have actually just kept growing naturally and annexed the areas around it.
Yup. He mentioned how Fort Wayne can't do well in septic, and that was a factor in its ability to annex land and incorporate into Fort Wayne's boundaries. If you have soil that is conducive to a well and septic, that means your neighborhood does not need to be dependent upon the city for things like sewage and water, meaning they can operate independent of the city. Fort Wayne soil, on the other hand, couldn't handle wells and septic, so any new neighborhood built out had to be annexed into the city to be dependent upon the water and the sewers. Next, we talk about the worst decade in South Bend's history. Think housing crash. And then in that same article, you talked about the worst decade in South Bend history as far as the population decline and all that goes. And you laid out why that's this decade, which was the 2000s, just wreaked havoc on us. More than just the previous 40 years where we did lose a good chunk of people, 25,000 people. Just give me an overview why that 2000s was just the worst.
So one thing that again, these things that I found out in my research and stuff that I think is just not known is South Bend never shrank its households up until 2000.
Yes,
South Bend always had more households than it did the year before, even through the Studebaker collapse, even when we were losing population, because exactly we talked about household size decline.
Yes.
So it was small growth. It was not this rapid. It was not enough to make up for the household size decline.
Right.
It was not enough to make up for some of those free fall neighborhoods. But we were still annexing small bits here on the south side. A lot of the south side was annexed post 1960, some on the northwest. So we were still slowly growing. Now we used to be growing by thousands of households a decade. It shifted down to a couple hundred, but we were still growing every single decade. The only decade in South Bend's entire history where we lost households was 2000, 2010. and it entirely had to do with the housing crash.
Yep.
Because it just literally pulled the rug from under some of these neighborhoods where if you had a neighborhood, say, I don't know, like Rum Village or even say near Kennedy Park.
Yeah.
Where, it was struggling and every year some houses were demoed, but it was still substantially there in its, form, right? But all the houses are worth 20 to 40 grand.
Yeah.
If you have basically what the housing crash did, and you can't get into why the housing crash happened.
Of course.
But the housing crash basically cut prices nationwide. If you cut a house out in Granger from $300,000 to $150,000, that house is still worth it. It still makes sense to put a roof on a $150,000 house. It's still, and because it was their nest egg, it still made sense for those people to hold out for the value to come back and still maintain their property. It does not make sense to maintain a $20,000 house.
No.
Especially if you had a $40,000 mortgage on it. Say you bought it in 2005.
Yeah.
And then now you're turning around. You just squeaked by. You were just on the viability where a bank would give you a mortgage for a $40,000 house because it's just not worth their time to do anything less.
Right.
You get to that point, and then hey, now your house is worth 15 grand. I'm not going to put a roof on that house.
Nope.
Unless I really love the house for sentimental reasons or something. But no financial person would say, hey, put a new, furnace in this house. They'll just let the house crumble. Because you're never going to get your money back.
Yeah.
So this happened, nationwide, and it really hit the Rust Belt. It did. Pummeled us in ways that people to think about, like, oh, Vegas and Florida got hit by it. But they just took a 10-year pause, and now they're right back.
Correct.
This ripped out the lifeblood of a lot of these neighborhoods.
That's a good point, man.
Like, oh, I'm sorry, Vegas took a 10-year pause on its crazy...
On their brand new subdivisions that they were building
exactly.
It wasn't the fabric and the core of their city.
Exactly. It was not... Yeah, you see the pictures of like, oh, we only built 2 houses, then we went under. It's like, oh, boo-hoo. Like, you shouldn't be building in a desert anyway, in my opinion. But like,
right.
But this happened to our neighborhoods that were, these neighborhoods have been there for 120 years at these points. These are neighborhoods that date to 1880.
Yep.
Especially like Kennedy Park, for example. Like that's 1870 to 1900 when that neighborhood grew. And like it had been a neighborhood for 100 years. And now, it's still there. We still want to provide services to those residents, but it would be in such a better position if the housing crash never happened the way it did. But so that's why I call it the worst decade in Southern history. Because it's the only decade. We lost 3,000 households.
It's insane. And now, a brief message from me to you, my listeners. Folks, I need your help in spreading the good word about Round the Bend Now and Then with your friends and family who you think would enjoy it. I obviously want to grow the show and increase our listeners, but I also want to be sure that we share the good things that we learn about the people that I interview in their businesses, their organizations, books, etc. To share, all you have to do is copy the show's website, paste it in a text, and hit send to a friend. Or just tell them to Google Round the Bend Now and Then, and it's right there. Tell them that we're on all of the popular podcast apps like Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and so forth. And while you're at it, tell them to download, like, or subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app that they're using. And if they're feeling especially squirrely, tell them to leave a review on why they love Round the Bend Now and Then. I thank you in advance for helping to spread the good word. And now, back to our episode. Next, you'll hear about something that I had no clue happened. And it turns out there was quite the community battle surrounding a large-scale annexation plan of Mayor Joe Kernan and his housing forum that included laws being made at the state capitol in Indianapolis specifically crafted to make it impossible for South Bend's boundaries to grow. Your 5th article, The Great Annexation War of South Bend Inner Suburbs, that was, to me, that was great. I love seeing stuff like this because it's truly gave you a bird's eye view of kind of how cities have grown through varied annexations over the years. And specifically, though, I want to talk about Mayor Kernan.
Yeah.
When I was reading this, I had no clue about Mayor Joe Kernan. He created a mayor's housing forum in what, like 1990?
Yeah, 91.
Something like that. And I was a kid. I was like 11 or 12, so I had no clue. But it was a pretty big deal. And what came of it, there was an annexation policy and a plan for the city of South Bend around that time. And when you started diving deep into research, you found that it was a heated debate.
Oh, it was insane. Like
Man.
it covered like the news for like a year was this
Wow.
annexation. So basically the annexation report came out and said, you're on an unsustainable path
Yes.
with your declining population. You're also an unsustainable path because the region keeps getting bigger and you keep getting smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you're having more people come and use your roads. You're having more people, more services for homeless, whatever you're going to have to provide for a larger, regional population. But your own resources are shrinking. What are you going to do to capture this new growth that's happening? Well, the report had a lot of recommendations, but it basically boiled down to annex. You have to, people that are on the edge of the city that don't pay city taxes need to be included. Like that's just, they use city services. They typically work in South Bend. Like you have to try to capture that, wealth and just so you can pay the bills.
Right.
Like none of this is done. Some people get upset like, oh, this is done for power or something. It's like, yeah, sure. Maybe there's some egotistical people out there, but like you can look at a spreadsheet and if it shows declining population, you're like, what are you going to do to turn that around? Yeah. So the report, which is a great report, it's still online on the city's website because it's a report the city paid for. Yeah. Okay. And it basically says, you need to annex, especially you have to annex the neighborhoods that are intrinsically linked within South Bend, and Kernan went out and tried to do it. And he had a little bit of success, especially there was a couple at the time they were called islands of unannexed land in the city limits.
Like Notre Dame or is
no, it was just like random little properties and random little neighborhoods that like held out when everything around. And so the state at the time allowed you basically to if you're surrounded by city property, you need to be in this. So those got cleaned up, but the big targets were, a lot of Clay Township, a lot of German Township, some on Center Township on the south side. And, Kernan went and tried to annex this stuff.
Right.
And at the time, there were laws that basically said you could, even if you didn't have the people's permission, if you could prove that these were essentially part of your city. That these were South Bend residents in all but name.
Yep.
And even name, they have South Bend addresses.
Of course they do, which is crazy.
That's why come election time, you always get the people like, I have a South Bend address. Why can't I vote? And it's like, you're not actually in the city.
That's just crazy.
So he went and tried to do this, and the people fought so hard, and they had been fighting for decades. This would always spring up, but Kernan was the last gasp to try to do it. And it was from the 50s, 60s. That's why Clay Township exists in its current form, is because they fought that from the beginning very successfully. There's very little Clay Township in the city limits. And, the article has all these quotes from people who write in from both sides on the Tribune, letter to the editor stuff. But it got so crazy that the representatives from Granger and from, Center and from Clay Township went down to Indy. They were state reps, and they got the state to change the state law for annexations for only St. Joe County.
Nuts.
For only St. Joe County. They passed one law for only, it was only counties of this type of population. That was us.
It was literally an amendment was added that made the bill applicable to counties in Indiana, only counties in Indiana with a population between 200 and 300,000. And St. Joe County was the only county.
At the time we were the only, and like whenever a county would get into that bracket, they would change it again to just really specify St. Joe County. And this affected Mishawaka too. Like the Mishawaka mayor hated this too.
Yeah,
like I think it was Buter at the time. Like I have quotes from him saying like how stupid this policy is because it made it impossible to annex land. It didn't just make it difficult. It essentially said unless you get 100% of people to sign off on this, and like there is still technically is a way you can do it, but it takes like 3 years. You have to have so many, and like you can get sued over it. It's basically makes it impossible for a city to annex land. Golly. Unless it's fully voluntary. 100% of the residents, 100% of landowners volunteer. Because we still every day or every year we still have 1 or 2 random annexations, but it's usually one-off properties that for whatever reason want to be in the city.
Imagine if every resident in a city roughly the size of LaPorte, Indiana, about 20,000 people, all hopped in their cars and drove into South Bend every weekday morning and then drove back in the evenings. That's how South Bend's net population increases every workday. You'll hear about that next, and a few other wild stats about our city.
There's the one article about jobs too as well that I think a lot of misconceptions had is like if you said, if you go to down the street and ask 100 people why we lost population, they say, oh, Studebaker closed, all the jobs left. But that's not really the case. Like
nope, because your stat alone, the commuter adjusted population or the daytime population I think it increased 23,000 people
Yeah.
or something like that.
Every day, and again, this was pre-COVID, so
Of
there might
course.
be some
Of
differences.
course.
But like Memorial is one of the bigger draws of that.
Uh-huh.
And like you ain't doing that job remote.
No.
Right? Nurses aren't remote.
No.
So like a lot of that. So yeah, every day, 20,000 more people come into the city to work and then they leave every day. And that includes the South Bend people who might work elsewhere.
Correct.
Like that's a net gain of 20,000.
Yeah.
So it's actually more than 20,000 people
because some of us leave.
Yeah. So
of course.
Yeah. I have a friend who works in Mishawaka schools.
Yeah.
That's fine. But there's also the jobs in South Bend pay better than the jobs in Mishawaka and in the jobs in the county.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't have guessed that.
Nope, me
like
neither.
before I looked into this, like I would like, yeah, okay, the jobs in South Bend pay high. Like if everyone had to live where they work, and and this is not American. This is not what we would like, not legal. I'm just,
of course,
it's a thought experiment.
Yeah.
If everyone had to live in the jurisdiction that they worked, South Bend would be the wealthiest portion of our county by like a substantial margin.
And that's even with all of our current folks who aren't as wealthy.
Yeah,
who are poverty riddled.
Because we have a lot of low paying jobs
a lot
too.
Of that, yeah.
But we have a ton of high paying jobs in this city that just a very small amount of those people live here.
That's wild, man. That's nuts. Many of you follow the @RoundTheBend574 Twitter account. It's kind of where the roots of this podcast started. And you'll know that I occasionally post pictures of neighborhoods around the city that I'm walking or jogging through. Obviously, the best way to capture the essence of a neighborhood is to live there. But we can only live in one place at a time, so the next best thing is to get out your car, walk a neighborhood, feel it, smell it, look the neighbors in the eye, and ask them how they're doing. I've been going to different neighborhoods in our area for a good 20 years or so now, because it helps me continue to feel a connection to different areas in my city. Next, we talk about just that, and how even though some of our neighborhoods have been decimated with population and household losses, they are still neighborhoods with families hosting kids' birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and basketball games in the driveway. And then the sixth article is the cost of South Bend's decline. But I love your quote about your grandfather's former neighborhood on Napier. And Napier Street neighborhood is similar to a lot of our neighborhoods. And you said, while I see a vacant field and think of what once had been, that very same field is part of the current neighborhood where residents still live. I mean, we're thinking, oh man, because I do the same thing. I go out, I'll drive to a neighborhood and I'll walk it just because you cannot get a sense of the fabric of a neighborhood unless you like smell it, feel
get out of the car.
Get out of the car, man. And so I think the same thing. I think, God, man, 60 years ago, this must have been unbelievable houses here. It's still a neighborhood to this day.
This is not some thought experiment.
No, people still live there.
Yeah, that was, I wanted to really frame that too, because I didn't want to be the guy who's just like pining for the good old days. I didn't even live. Like my dad didn't even really live these good old days. Like he lived through the decline. Like it was
just as much as everybody else. Yeah.
And so I was out at, I talk in the article, but I went and I photographed like where my, grandfather and great grandfather lived. And, the house is long gone, but like, there were like kids walking around and there were, kids playing basketball and there was someone grilling like 3, vacant lots down at a house. So it's like, this is still a neighborhood. There's still hundreds or thousands of people living in these, in these neighborhoods. Like we should do what's best for those current population now. Yes. Not worry about bringing back what's gone.
Yes.
What can we do to make their lives easier? What can we do to make their lives better, more economic? And like we do for every neighborhood, what can we do to provide better economic opportunities so that people want to build new houses there?
Yep.
So I wanted to talk about that a little bit of, it's one thing to get trapped in this mindset of decline, but there's 100,000 people living here.
Damn right.
Going to school every day, going to work every day, living their lives, having love, people falling in love, falling out of love, having disagreements. There's still lives happening here, but so often South Bend and cities like it are just written off as the past. When it's like, well, it's not the past to my 3-year-old.
No,
my 4-year-old. Like they're just, this is their whole future is here. They care about what they're eating in the morning. Like we still have responsibilities to the city to make sure the decline does not continue.
And that, that was just a perfect way to put it, is when you were there and you're thinking of, what it must have used to look like. And we have to stay out of that mind state. And that is spot on right there. We still have the responsibility to those neighbors to ensure that they have the city services needed so that their kids can continue to shoot hoops in the driveway, continue to ride their bikes, or even go on an evening walk. Now, a sad part about South Bend's history and other cities across the country is the practice of redlining. Basically, it systematically kept neighborhoods Anglo-Saxon white. Deeds on houses would basically say, if you're black, you can't live here. Maps were created with different zones in the city detailing, this is a white neighborhood, this is an African American neighborhood. Banks wouldn't loan to African Americans in white neighborhoods. So best believe there is a racial component to all of this. In our next episode, you'll hear me meet with Gabrielle Robinson. She's the author of Better Homes of South Bend, which is a book that details the story behind a group of African Americans who banded together to build brand new houses in a neighborhood that was labeled as white around the North Elmer Street area. They simply wanted a better neighborhood for their families. Next, Joe and I talked just a little bit about the redlining, and I just wanted to mention about the next episode to let you know that we'll get into the racist homeowning policies in our city next time.
And a lot of that's racial.
Oh,
like a lot, and not even racial, but also classist.
Yes.
Like, white working class,
classist,
as well as, an African American, racial and Hispanic racial bias against. But a lot of it's, we don't want those poles over here.
Yeah. Oh,
now that was what it was in the 20s and 30s when this very first started happening. Was redlining also negatively affected
immigrant groups.
Immigrant group. Yep. My house today in Sunnymead says I shouldn't live there because I come from an East European descent. As well as saying a Jew should not live there and an African American. That's what the deeds on Whitcomb and Colors, who built Sunnymead's houses say. Yeah. Now, granted, they're not valid anymore.
No, they're
but that's
illegal.
What this neighborhood was built for, was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant managers of Studebaker.
Yeah. God, that's just so crazy, man. Folks who know me know that I will stand on whatever platform available to not let the community only focus on the negative. I am a champion for our city and will take every opportunity to celebrate the good things that are going on. In Joe's last article, South Bend Survived, he writes about that. And next, we passionately talk about it as well. Dude, I love, Article 7, South Bend Survived. There are still 100,000 people who live in our area. I mean, just yesterday, I ran in the Girls on the Run race over here at the park, and there were thousands of people there to support South Bend kids, South Bend young ladies specifically, who go to schools in South Bend, who took part in this whole Girls on the Run program. That's just one example, but man, you go to a South Bend Cubs game, you go to the East race, you go to the zoo. We're still alive.
Yeah.
We're still jumping.
We're not living in a museum.
No.
And I tell people all the time, like, I want South Bend to get better.
Of course.
Of course, everyone wants, but like, I love living here today. I loved living here yesterday. It is what you make of it. And I think this city still has so many great things it can offer somebody that maybe other areas can't.
You're darn
right. Like, we've had a housing price increase, but it's still nothing like what you see anywhere else, like in the country. We're not even to where they were 5 years ago.
Turn on House Hunters, you'll learn that quick.
Yeah, like, it's just, you can buy a house in a neighborhood where you can walk down to the river and be on a 30-mile river walk, and you can buy that house still for $120,000, in Keller Park.
Yeah.
That's still, and you can own the home.
Yes.
You don't have to be a renter.
Yep.
You can still do things in this city that I think provide really great opportunities. We have a lot of great culture things. Like the Morris alone is always rated a top 50 theater in the United States.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. We have, like you said, the South Bend Cubs is rated the top, top one or top two, minor league teams in the country. So we have really, if you're really big into academics, you have one of the premier academic institutions in the country, Notre Dame here. We have resources here.
In that same article, the South Bend Survived article, Joe compared other Rust Belt cities, roughly the same size as South Bend from at the time our population started to shrink. And it turns out we are in much better shape than the majority of them. We talk about that next.
And it showed out in the stats too. One thing in that article I talked about is like, there are a few cities too that looked like us in 1960.
Yeah, you did.
That
you
did
nice
better
comparison.
than us. Like
yes.
Fort Wayne and Grand Rapids are probably the two I called out. I think that they figured stuff out that we didn't. But there are so many that looked really similar to us in 1960 that are in way worse shape. Like
Flint,
Youngstown,
Gary,
Flint,
Youngstown,
Canton. Even Evansville has seen more decline than us. So it could be a way worse.
Yeah.
Like Gary is obviously, the poster child of that. And like Gary again lost 7,000 people last decade while we were growing.
That's just
so
crazy.
Like Youngstown lost thousands of people last decade while we were growing. So you can point to very clear examples of like these two cities were on the same trajectory and South Bend was able to pull out. And now, granted, again, nothing's perfect.
Nope.
Nothing's great. We still have issues with crime. We still have issues with disinvestment, but it could be so much worse.
Oh, it could be horrible. When I met with former South Bend Mayor Roger Parent and also read his book about leadership called Getting Things Done, I learned a very powerful quote from Father Ted Hesburgh. We talk about that quote next and how important it is for city leaders to heed the advice of Father Ted. I do want to talk about city investment. When you talked about the South Bend survived, when I met with Mayor Parent down here, he and in his book also he mentioned a quote from Father Ted Hesburgh is, damned if you're due, if you're damned if you're due, or if you're damned if you don't, then do. Yeah. And imagine if our city leaders would have listened to the naysayers when the East Race came up or when building of Kovaleski Stadium came up. All of these things. Imagine if they would have said no.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and even just economically, we've gotten some stuff right. Like the city has exploded on the northwest side in warehousing.
With the shipping and
warehousing. The shipping and like those aren't the best jobs ever, but they're not bad jobs either. They're jobs on the west side of the city. And if you look at, I think I have an aerial in one of the articles, like from 1980 to today, and it's like, okay, here's 30 huge giant buildings, and some of them are factories that support like 3,000, 4,000 people working. So some of, has the city made mistakes? Of course.
Oh, like which one hasn't?
Like, of course, the city's ran and the city is made up of fallible people who are going to make mistakes, but you have to try. You have to try. Yeah. Imagine the East Side or East Bank today without these rays.
I hesitate to think of that because it would be awful.
And like even just recently, like imagine life without Howard Park.
Yeah.
Like every day I go home and it is the most diverse group of people. It is not just, suburbanites, not just East Side. It is a diverse group of people enjoying the park. Imagine if we hadn't done that. Because I remember going to Howard Park, even just my daughter was like 1. So it had to have been only like right before the major renovation.
Okay. Yeah.
And we walked down there. And it was empty on a Saturday afternoon. And like the slide was like rusted out. It was
parking lot, big potholes.
There was a giant parking lot and like no one was there. You go any Saturday in the summer now and there's 1,000 people there literally.
Get through there.
Like in just 5 years.
And imagine if at the time when I guarantee you, if I pull up old articles from even that time, somebody's going to complain about spending X amount of millions on doing that. But look what that has sparked. You drive up and down Jefferson Boulevard, you have people eating in the restaurant in Howard Park. They're crossing the street. They're walking up and down.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
dogs,
beautiful.
People walking their dogs everywhere.
To think Joe's More People series started during COVID is just a side project. Diving into old Tribune articles and trying to wrap his head around the history of our city's population. And what came about it is what is now 9 different articles, including 2 more that he wrote after the initial series, recapping the 2020 census, in which we grew, thank you very much. Next, we talk about how the More People article series has morphed into a resource for Notre Dame, the city, and beyond.
Notre Dame students read it for their, I've met with,
I never even thought of that.
I've met with 5 or 6 Notre Dame students who have written it on their dissertation. And it's, I've got a friend, Marty Meckenberg, who works in the city.
Okay.
He gives it to AmeriCorps volunteers who come in who aren't familiar with the city at all. He gives it to them to look at, to say like, this is a good like preview of South Bend, like a little taste, before you just jump right into some of these neighborhoods.
Correct.
So it's really kind of taken on a life of its own.
I wouldn't have ever even thought of that either. I mean, like, you're literally universities here, and it's a nice foundational piece of how we've gotten to be where we're at now.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. Thank you, Joe, for coming on and sharing the background and information from your More People series. And again, folks, you will not find a more comprehensive, understandable, descriptive account of our city's population shifts than this. And his More People series is more than just talk about the census. It is our history. So, Joe, I thank you for your endless hours working on this, as it is crucial that we understand where we have been so that we can move forward. Join us again next time and learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.